Greetings, everyone, and welcome to City Lights Live. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight we continue our 70th anniversary celebratory programming with a panel discussion that brings together some of those who are at the very heart of City Lights. The program is titled Insurgent Beatitudes, the History of a Cultural Center, and it'll explore the historic trajectories which brought us to the present. City Lights was founded as a cultural hub, providing space and encouragement for a creative cross-pollination across literature, the arts, as well as the realms of politics, philosophy, and social change. Now, here's a chance to hear about our history from some of the folks who've been significant contributors over the years, working alongside Lawrence Ferlinghetti and beyond, guiding City Lights into its present and future. Before we begin, as is customary, I'd like to remind everyone we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush peoples. I'd like to take this moment to offer our respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Joining us tonight will be David Ulin as moderator of this panel. David has been a dear friend of the stores for many, many years. He is the author or editor of nearly 20 books, including Sidewalking, Coming to Terms with Los Angeles, and the novel Ear to the Ground. His fiction has appeared in Black Clock, the Santa Monica Review, Scoundrel Time, Zyzzyva, amongst others. He has a new book coming out in October. It's called 13 Question Method, published by Outpost 19. We're going to be hosting a little party for that on October 25th. So if you're in the hood, come on down. Also joining us tonight is Elaine Katzenberger, the executive director of City Lights and the publisher of City Lights books. Also with us is Amy Scholder, a literary editor, documentary filmmaker, and former editor at City Lights Books, where she began her career. And last but not least, Paul Yamazaki, the principal buyer at City Lights Booksellers for more than 40 years. He has served as a great champion for books, writers, publishers, and independent bookstores. He's going to be presented with a Literary and Lifetime Achievement Award in November of this year. This will be a very casual conversation amongst friends. David will traverse each person's unique journey at City Lights, offering insight into its historical trajectories and really what is at the core of the values and mission of City Lights. We're going to leave a little room at the end of the panel for questions and comments from the audience, so please do post those in the chat of your Zoom dashboard. Join us now in welcoming David Ulin to get the evening started. Welcome, David. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm really delighted to be part of this. City Lights has been a huge part of my cultural, intellectual, artistic life since I was a teenager when I first went to the bookstore. And, it's an honor to be doing this, and it was an honor to publish a book with City Lights. It's just been, as you all know, it's been a centerpiece. So I should say I'm doing this from the office at Skylight Books, an independent bookstore in Los Angeles, because I have another event at 7 o'clock. But we thought it was kind of interesting or useful, since I think all of the independent bookstores in the contemporary United States are really the kind of cultural and spiritual offspring of City Lights. So I'm kind of glad that we were able to make this all work. We're going to just have a free-form conversation for about a half an hour or so, and then we'll turn it over to some questions from the audience. And I think let's start with you, Elaine, as the director of, as the current director of City Lights. Why don't we just start with a little bit about your journey into the City Lights universe? I want to talk a little bit later about kind of where that universe is going, but why don't we just start with sort of, I should also say we regrettably don't have Nancy Peters with us this evening. We were hoping that she was going to be able to be a part of this, but she wasn't. She is also a huge part of the history of the bookstore and the publishing company, and of course Lawrence as well, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who is no longer with us, but who is still with us very much. And I'm sorry that both of those people can't be here this evening on the 70th to discuss the 70th anniversary. So anyway, without further ado, I will be quiet. Elaine, let's start with you.
Well, I was recruited into the bookstore in 1987 by the former manager of the bookstore. I had worked as a bartender while I was attending school, and got to know Richard Berman, and was bartending around in North Beach, and I'd come to the end of my rope doing that, and knew I needed to find a career direction in my life other than becoming a great painter. And Richie came in and offered me a job, and so I started working at City Lights in the bookstore. And I'd always been an avid reader. That was something from my childhood on. I was always one of those kids who read a lot. So I'd been in the bookstore plenty, but I had never thought about working there. And, like a lot of small businesses, I think City Lights is a place that recognizes, you look at somebody who might be a keeper and then you try to keep them. And, Paul is one of the people who initially sort of started working on me as like, here, like sort of trying to draw me in and encourage me to think about staying. From there, it's just been 37 years of working in various positions. I started working in the publishing end of things, just proofreading books at first. And but then in 1993, Nancy Peters started to give me some projects in the publishing house, and Amy was still an editor at City Lights back then. And she and Nancy both mentored me initially. And then Amy left for the big world of New York publishing. And that's really when it opened up a space for me to really become an editor at City Lights and move forward. And, 14 years later, Nancy retired, and then I assumed her position as director of the company and publisher of City Lights. And by that time, Lawrence also had, in 2007, Lawrence was 88 or something. He was sort of ready to not come in every day anymore. And Nancy had really been running things for him for quite a while. And when Nancy left, that's really when Lawrence also sort of let go completely. That's when I started, and I've been at it for 16 years now.
Sorry. It's a lot that I want to come back and talk to you about kind of what it was like once Lawrence and Nancy were not involved any longer, and kind of the notion of the legacy of City Lights, but also the kind of the need for the organization, the bookstore, the publishing company, the cultural center to kind of move forward into the future as well. But before we do that, I want to kind of get everybody else's origin story, and then we'll come back and talk about those things. So Amy, in terms of your own involvement, can you talk a little bit about how you got sort of, brought into this nexus, or how you came into this nexus?
I sort of pushed my way in. I was just hanging out a lot at City Lights as in my final year of college. I was going to Berkeley, living in San Francisco with a seemingly useless English degree and really no fucking idea what I was going to do with my life, and had no real, I don't know, I just had no vision. And all I kind of knew was, where do I feel good? And I felt good going to North Beach and being in the shop and discovering books and going next door to Vesuvio and hanging out, but really kind of feeling a sense of, I don't know, I just had a longing to be part of that space. Though I was so much younger at that time than anyone else who was around on staff. But for some reason, I just saw myself there, and I don't even remember how I went up to Nancy Peters, who, for those of you who know the geography of the store, know that, these publishing is upstairs, and so not inaccessible, but not exactly, you don't run into folks. But I somehow met her. I somehow talked to her and said, I want to learn how to edit books, and I want to work here. And she's like, well, we don't have any jobs, and there's only a few of us who work here. And I was like, well, can you, can I be an intern? Like, not in any like official capacity. It was really just like, can you teach me? And she was like, well, we don't really do that. And I don't know, I just somehow talked my way into her saying yes. And I think maybe she saw that there could be an extra pair of hands. And I was kind of a weird kid, and maybe it just seemed like I would fit in. So I was delighted. I also needed to make some money, and so they found Richie, who Elaine was just speaking of, found some shifts for me to work in the shop, Thursday nights and Sundays, for starters. And so then I just, I got to know Rex Ray, who was working on Thursday nights and going to the Art Institute, and Jen Sturgeon, who was also a lifer and working on Sundays in bookstore, and and then Nancy just really taught me how to be an editor, and also, because it's such a small operation, how to be a publisher too. And I started to learn how she edited books and how she was in relation to her authors. And we had, it's pre-desktop publishing, so we had our type was being made up the street by the research folks, and I'd run up there to get E and an extra and cut and paste, all this prehistoric, makes me sound 100 years old, but it was a great way to learn about book publishing, and then also to work in the shop at the same time and be on the retail side of it was something I think that made me a much different kind of publisher later on, to have had that experience of being face to face with consumers at the same time. So within a few years I was acquiring and editing and worked there for 10 years full time.
Paul, I want to bring this to you. What Amy's describing sounds to me like a cultural or artistic infrastructure or ecosystem. There's City Lights, the type is being made at Research, there's Vesuvio, there's Rex is going to the Art Institute, all of these kind of institutions, many of which no longer exist, which makes me also feel like I'm 100 years old. But I want you, I mean, you've been there for longer than anyone on this panel, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your origin, but also I'm interested in your sense of that idea of City Lights as a cultural hub, or as part of a cultural infrastructure that didn't only involve City Lights, but also involved a whole bunch of other literary and artistic organizations and individuals throughout North Beach and the Bay Area.
Well, I think City Lights originated that. I think that was part of Lawrence Ferlinghetti's original vision, along with Peter Martin, and that then shared by Sigma Rao and Nancy Peters. But in 1953, when Peter and Lawrence opened the store, North Beach was very much an immigrant community. On the south side of Broadway was mostly Chinese and Cantonese populations. On the north side of Broadway is Italian and Latino. And and because it was a working class community, in many cases, the rents were cheap, and which left room for artists to come in. And so there was also a period where, as the various immigrant communities achieved a greater kind of economic status, they were leaving the kind of core immigrant community, and that left even more space. And so and then the third part of the community was the old Barbary Coast, which was international seamen. And so there's always this kind of, that gave the whole neighborhood a bohemian flavor. And so there's always this intermixture, historically, almost from 1849 all the way through. And Lawrence just saw, in the kind of post-war ferment, how to him and to many people, it seemed much freer than it did on the East Coast. And so, you have to look at, Kenneth Rexroth and Robert Duncan were really instrumental in, when Lawrence first came in here, community was already in formation.
So you came in as you were 19 when you started. Can you talk a little bit about your sort of early?
Yeah, so I was very active politically. This is the late 60s. And so I participated in Stop Draft Week. The October 67, remained active, was participant in the San Francisco State Strike, which was the longest student strike in American history. the person who brought me into City Lights was Francis Oka, who was also an activist. And so and we were kind of political comrades. And so he brought me into City Lights. I was, through my various political activities, I was sentenced to 2 6-month sentences in county jail. And I was there when Lawrence and Bob McBride, who was the manager at that time, hired me sight unseen, because Francis said that it would be a good thing for City Lights. I think there goes the other part, like, Lawrence's vision, and kind of what Elaine and Peter and myself have done over the years is exactly that: build off of trust. As long as we share a common vision, everybody did their jobs with kind of, in this very independent fashion. And I think we continue that to this day. And it's without Nancy.
We may have lost Paul. Oh, here he comes back. Okay.
I think he's coming back. Yeah.
Yeah.
See if we can get him activated. Hold on a sec.
Well, he's muted. Paul, unmute. I think if you unmute, you're good.
Yeah. There you go. There we go. He's
Yeah, it's been cutting out on me. Am I back?
Yep, you're back.
Okay. So as I was saying, like, Nancy and Elaine have kind of given us the institutional stability and shared Lawrence's vision that has allowed us to kind of continue to celebrate our 70th anniversary. And I certainly think, and I think that's shared by everybody at City Lights, that, that because of readers and writers, it's such an active conversation that, the road for City Lights seems to extend well over the horizon, as far as I'm concerned. Well past, after I'm gone, there will be a City Lights.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing. Elaine, maybe we can come back to you and talk about, I want to ask you a little bit, if you can talk about the influence of Nancy. And I also want to ask you about, well, let's start with that, and then I'll follow up with something else.
So you want me to talk about Nancy's influence?
A little bit, yeah, if you don't mind.
I mean, Paul has said many times, and I think I have seen it myself, even what Paul always refers to when he says this is before I started working there, and he says, without Nancy, City Lights wouldn't exist. And that has to do with a certain period when City Lights was being really mismanaged and had kind of gone, to a bad place. And Lawrence was busy being Lawrence, and, he was an international celebrity poet and, a painter, and being who he was, and trusting that these people were doing their job, and they weren't doing it very well. And, Nancy stepped up and sort of brought a certain, I don't know if it's business-like practices, because I don't think she knew anything about that herself at the time either. I mean, she was completely self-taught but she did sort of help Lawrence to put things right, along with Paul and some other folks who worked in the store stepped up into the roles. Paul is in the role he assumed then now. So, but what I witnessed during my own time, like I came, 6 or 7 years later, Nancy did what a lot of women do in situations like this, which is, organize things, get it straight, make sure that all of this creative stuff going on around actually fits into some framework that makes sense, so that people function and that the bills are paid. And, I just feel like in some ways it's very traditional that, at least, through patriarchal society, that there's always like some woman behind the great man, and Nancy was that person. And Nancy was a brilliant poet and an artist herself, and she had her own desires and goals when it was time for her to really work alongside Lawrence as an editor. And she really shaped City Lights Publishing House, I think, from the 70s, when she sort of came in and joined Lawrence as a sort of part-time semi-assistant and whatever, until when she really assumed things. and she has had a large part in shaping things. And Amy's story tells you something key too, because the same thing. I mean, that kind of generosity of spirit in terms of like mentoring someone and showing you, this is how it's done. That's how I learned too. And I'm not the only one. And Amy, there are others beyond Amy and I. And so I think that Nancy is this unsung hero of the history of City Lights, because for most of the time that she was here doing her job, Lawrence was still quite active and visible in the world. And people always just assumed he was doing everything. And Nancy was naturally a sort of retiring personality and didn't want all the front, attention. And so, but she's really the one who was doing the work and had a vision along with him and helped shape his vision. And he's very, I mean, when speaking to him and he's done interviews, he's very clear about that too. He never would not acknowledge that. I think that, it was a real collaboration between the two of them. But there was always, and that is something that I try to model as well. What Paul is talking about is this sort of openness and generosity of like letting people learn and encouraging people to learn and take roles and have opportunities. I mean, this place is really, I don't think there's many stories anymore, but even in the era in which we're talking about, where people like start at the bottom and rise to the top, I mean, that really says a lot about what the ethos of this place is. And so, it's something that I feel like it's just part of what needs to continue along with everything else here, is that kind of that spirit of nurturing people into, futures that they might not even know they want,
Well, that's true. That's true of the readers as well, right? I mean, in terms of hopefully the effect of the books.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Amy, I was thinking when we first met, when you sent me, or first got to know each other, when you sent me a copy of Leslie Dick's first book, I think, which you had edited. And it was interesting because it was with that book that I first began to really focus on kind of, let's call it second wave City Lights, or, I was familiar with all the beat work, of course, even though Lawrence always said he wasn't an in-house publisher for the beats. But it marked a real shift. And then, the books that started coming out, I think, in the late 80s and then moving into the 90s and ongoingly represented both a kind of continuation of the legacy, but also an expansion of the legacy and a move into other more contemporary aesthetic and political concerns. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that from your position on the ground as that was happening, as you were beginning to acquire books and publish books, the kind of leeway or freedom you had, the sense of relationship to the tradition, if we want to use that word, of City Lights, but also to kind of expanding it.
Sure. That Leslie Dick book, Without Falling, I think was my first book that I acquired. I was, I believe that's true. Leslie is an American writer who was living in England, and it was a Serpent's Tail book, and I brought it to the US and really loved that book. But my sense, I think, of starting to work at City Lights was that here was this, interesting kind of canon of renegade radical literature, but it didn't feel up to date to me in terms of American writers. I think at that time, Nancy was really interested in what was happening in other cultures and other parts of the world. And I saw this opening for me to bring in the kind of marginalized voices in the 80s, or late 80s, early 90s that would fit with the kind of mandate that was what City Lights was based in. So So I went in 1989, for example. I met Karen Finley, the performance artist in New York, who had a significant following in the downtown New York world, but was only starting to perform in other cities. And when I saw her perform and saw and felt the kind of literary foundation of her practice, had this idea that we could make a book, which turned out to be Shock Treatment, which was her first book in 1990. And
Another wonderful book.
yeah, thank you. I think so too. And that really dispatched me in looking for and finding and bringing to City Lights the queer voices that would continue the tradition, and the kind of other genre kind of books that I've always favored, that don't necessarily fit into poetry or fiction or essay, but sometimes fall within multiple genres, and there was space for me to do that.
Yeah. Paul, I want to ask you about this same kind of question from the bookseller's perspective. What Amy's describing is a kind of incredible freedom to sort of think for oneself, and I know that the bookstore also operates that way, in the sense that, the booksellers themselves have a lot of autonomy over books that come in. You're picking books not just for, or not even necessarily at all for commercial value, but for literary value. Can you talk a little bit about the curation of the bookstore and the books in the bookstore?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, David. For me, it begins in conversation, and there's like the conversations among my colleagues at City Lights, booksellers from around the country, and editors and people in publishing. And it really starts very simply, like asking the question, how does this book arrive in my hand that I love so much? And inevitably that leads back to the editor, and having that conversation and having that knowledge of what a particular editor does, and how they do it, just like in the same way that we have understanding of what Amy and Elaine do, you can extend that to editors around publishing houses, large and small. It makes City Lights appear a lot smarter than we actually are, just because we have a sense of what these editors, and so it looks like we're taking these huge chances, or we're kind of like promoting something that really hasn't like broken the surface. But we know, because we've had these long relationships and conversations with these editors, that they do really amazing work. And like Amy was Karen's first book, Leslie's first book, others. And so we're able to do these things, and it really does make us look smarter than we actually are.
Yeah. Gil Quadros, City of God, another one I think about, yeah. another City Lights book I think about all the time. Elaine, can you talk a little bit about now? I mean, I think this will be the last question before we turn it over to questions from the audience. But sitting here now in 2023, can you talk a little bit about it's different. North Beach is no longer the bohemian landscape that it was when City Lights opened. San Francisco is expensive. And yet City Lights continues, and you're also thinking in terms of sort of how to build out the list of books you're publishing for the future, recognizing the lineage, but also moving forward. So it's a big picture question about, I guess, the future of City Lights, and where you see the institution going.
I think that it's really important that City Lights continues to exist. I feel like it's quite obvious that we fill a need. The bookstore is, there are always people in the store, It doesn't mean that we're making money hand over fist and everything is rosy. Unfortunately, bookselling and publishing are not particularly remunerative activities, but it does show you that people need this, and the books as well. I mean, you get a lot of feedback from people about what we publish, not just the stuff that was, including the sort of canonical books from the beginning, Allen Ginsberg and what have you, but also, more current things. And I think that City Lights embodies a set of ideals and values and artistic sensibility and socio-political sensibilities that are reflected in the books we carry and the books we publish, that communicate a message and embody something. We're embodying a set of ideals by being here. And the world has changed since 1953, and it's in many ways, and at least in this regard, it's gotten worse. There aren't very many spaces that actually are idealistically driven anymore for people to go and know it. It's not a place that people are just trying to make a buck, and I think there's a big sense of relief for a person walking into this space or opening the pages of a book and knowing that there are other human desires that are being fulfilled and expressed and shared. And so to me, like, above and beyond any particularity of, what books we sell or what books we publish, like, that mission is clearly an imperative. And so, our job as the current iteration of this institution is to make sure that it continues. And the most challenging part of it is to look at ways of fiscally stabilizing it. It's not easy to publish books or be a bookseller, and especially in San Francisco, as you mentioned, it's an expensive city. It's hard to pay people a decent wage on the kind of profit that you make off of doing this activity. And so, finding creative ways to look forward and think about how that's going to work for a future generation of people who might not already be established. Paul and I are of an age where we've been in this city a long time. Once you've been here, you have your feet in the ground, you're okay. But if you're just starting, that's not easy. And so it has to be a place where younger people can come and work, and it also has to be, I think, passing forward the mission of the place is the other biggest challenge. It's not like you can take all of it and put it in a bottle and stop it, and then it comes out and someone can breathe it and, know what they're supposed to do. So, it's like that all has to be passed forward in a way that makes sure that City Light stays true to itself as well. Because, if we didn't, there have been so many opportunities along the way for City Lights to do things and engage in things that would diminish, the integrity of who we are and what we do. And, I think there's many times where we turn down those opportunities and we're met with absolute incredulity. It's just like, you don't want that money? You don't want, it's like, well, no, actually, that's not what we do. And to me, that part is really, I think that's the part I chew on the most, about how to make sure that future stewards of this institution will know, what it is, how to make those decisions, and it's a constantly morphing and changing environment. It's not as if I'm making the decisions that Ferlinghetti made in 1953, but there are sort of do's and don'ts that aren't always obvious, and they're not necessarily obvious to people who have grown up in a different era, a different era of social trends and the trajectory of capitalism and, politics in this country and all of these things that, some of us who, I wasn't born when City Lights was founded, but at least my life was a little bit more proximate to those years. But somebody now it might as well be the Civil War. So it's like, how do you make sure that people connect the dots and continue to do that? And I feel like that's the most important thing, to me anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that makes complete sense. And it's, I don't really believe in holy spots, but for me, City Lights is a holy spot. It always has been. I make, even if I'm in San Francisco for like an afternoon, I always make sure to go there. I love it. I can't imagine life without it. And I love you guys. It's really great to see you and talk to you. So let's turn it over to a couple of questions from the audience before we have to go.
Yeah. So Lucy asks, how has the prevalence of publicists changed how author, customer, staff engage in conversation and community? Accessibility versus time, local versus visiting. Any takers on that? Maybe Paul. Hold on, if I can find him. Paul.
Oh, generally, like, with you, Peter, it's like publicists aren't a big part of our world in the sense where because we have direct engagement with the editors and authors and publishers in many cases, and so and even if we did it, it just, our key thing is really just to be able to focus on the writer and the reader, and that those kind of ephemeral conversations really don't play a part in our consideration or kind of our practices, and and I think it's a real privilege to be able to do that. Not all our colleagues have that same kind of space that we have to operate in, and so and I think being fully aware of that privilege makes us even focus harder on trying to bring as much excellence as we can to as wide as readership as we can.
I'm looking for more questions and I don't see any just yet, but David, might you have something else that's on the tip of your tongue? Oh, you are muted. Hold on, let me see if I can get you up and running.
All right, I am unmuted. Let's see. I mean, I think the only other question that I would ask, and maybe it kind of spins off of this a little bit, we have been talking about it, but the relationship between the bookstore and the publisher strikes, or the bookstore and the publishing arm strikes me as unique, because as we've been hearing, people work across borders. Amy, when she was starting, was working shifts in the bookstore and also learning how to edit. The books are obviously sold at the store in all kinds of ways. Maybe if anyone wants to jump in on kind of, I think I think there is something really valuable about having that consumer facing experience, like interacting with the readers who are actually buying and reading these books. So perhaps this is, I guess, a jump ball question. If any of you want to jump in and talk about the benefit or the value of both of those, of the kind of symbiotic relationship between the bookseller and the publisher.
Well, I know from a bookseller's point of view, having the opportunity to talk to Elaine, to know Nancy and Amy, and to have an understanding of what the editorial and publishing process is, makes it much easier for the bookstore to kind of be able to have a more ecological sense of like what we are all part of together, and not to see it as, well, we do this and we do that kind of thing, but to see that more as a process. And so I think that's really fortunate from my point of view, is on the bookstore side to have that in.
And we lost Paul again.
Oh, we lost Paul. Can I say something about this? I just, when I heard that question about publicists, my thought immediately went to Stacey Lewis, who does marketing, sales, publicity at City Lights, and she too has been a lifer, and I know she's on this Zoom as well, and really is the kind of like anti-publicist that City Lights needs and deserves, where she really understands the heart of the work that's being done by the press and presents that to the world of book reviewers and also now direct to consumer, to the public. So I think on the publishing side of it, I think, under, especially with Elaine's leadership, there's been this real understanding of, with the changing technologies and with the changing relationships that now presses can have and must have through these other platforms that aren't just about, sending out review copies to critics, and journalists, there's been this more sophisticated approach and this kind of hand selling and relationship building that is also part and parcel of like this larger kind of sensibility that we've been talking about this evening about what City Lights tries to uphold and maintain and value and cherish about its relationships.
Yeah, and Elaine, do you want to have the last word on this?
I mean, I would say, yeah, I think that all of us who, let's see, certainly Stacy, me, not everybody who works for the publisher right now came through the bookstore, but both of us definitely did also. And we work in the bookstore. I mean, we're part of the crew with, people have different jobs, but it's one thing. And being informed and being part of and understanding how a bookstore works, what a bookstore needs, how that all works definitely makes a better publisher. It makes a better anybody working in publishing. A lot of people who work in publishing are handicapped that way because they don't really understand, what those relationships mean and we understand how difficult our jobs are, but we don't understand the economy of the bookstore and how difficult that is. So, and I would say that, Lawrence and Peter Martin, I mean, this combo was started so that two things could happen. And, it was meant always to be a symbiotic relationship so that both of these activities would somehow generate enough revenue so that both activities could happen. With one without the other wasn't possible, And up until now, that still worked to a certain degree that both help each other. And also, there's a way in which when you have a mission, one of the missions is to have this absolutely great bookstore where people can come in and find things, of all types. But one of the missions is like, but you have your point of view specifically that you want to express also. And then you can put it in between the covers of a book and push that out into the general world. And so like people don't have to come to your bookstore, they can find that all over the place. And so your voice is amplified in that way. And I think that those two activities are hand in glove for City Lights. That's why City Lights has the, the kind of following that it has. I think there's a whole lot of people who love the bookstore a great deal. And like you said, you come here and it's like a space that feels like a pilgrimage, but I think it's also the books that sort of perpetuate this loyalty and this curiosity about, well, what are the people there? What is City Lights doing? And I think that is an amazing resource that we wield. And that is, Lawrence and first, and then Lawrence and Nancy, and now we, that's something that we have that is like really powerful. And from the time I started working at City Lights, I knew that. And it was just so obvious, like people are looking to City Lights for some direction. So we have a great deal of agency, and it's our responsibility to use it wisely and, and deploy it, in the way that is very intentional and respectful of, the fact that this is a privilege to have that amount of power. And, I think that it's that amount of, I see people react to the media all the time, and it's always been the way it is that, there are news stories, and then you hear very intelligent people simply parroting something that's been said. So, you know, when you have that kind of ability to influence people's thinking and people's minds, you have to really think hard about what it is you're going to do with that, you know. And I think that's something that the bookstore and the publisher together, you know, that's quite a lot, and it's good.
It's great. I think, should we close it out, Peter?
Yeah,
or-
we're at the top of the hour. Also, you've got an event to attend.
You're those people down there. I just want to say thank you for asking me to be part of this. It's an honor to do this, and it's just a delight to see you all and talk to you. And may City Lights go on for another 70 and another 70 after that and another 70 after that. It's yay. Thank you all.
David, thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Really much appreciate you doing the honors tonight, and special thanks to my esteemed colleagues. I think it's important that our story be heard, even though we all tend to be a little modest about tooting our horn. So I really do appreciate that you know, we all kind of step to the plate. Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Please be well, everyone. Take care. We hope to see you all again soon.
Bye-bye. Thank you.